Washington, D.C. is a city of closely guarded secrets. In the storerooms and vaults of government agencies, there are now so many classified documents, no one is able to give a precise count. Experts estimate more than 150 million classified pages are stored at the CIA alone. And it was in the 1960s, when communism was seen as a threat to democracy, that powerful government agencies began their legacy of secrets and deception.
Agencies didn't share information with other agencies. Agencies didn't share information within agencies for fear of compromising the country during a time that was very, very fearful to many people, perhaps more so than it should have been, but it was.
It was in this clandestine atmosphere that a president was murdered on November 22nd, 1963.
It appears as though something has happened in the motorcade route. Something, I repeat, has happened in the motorcade route. The presidential car coming up now. We know it's the presidential car. You see Mrs. Kennedy's pink suit. There's a Secret Service man, spread eagle, over the top of the car. We can't see who has been hit, if anybody's been hit, but apparently something is wrong here. Something is terribly wrong.
Since that day in Dallas, 4 separate government-sponsored investigations have attempted to answer the question, who killed President Kennedy? From the beginning, their efforts were hampered by a lack of information, vital information the United States government refused to reveal. It was this missing evidence that made any attempt to discover exactly what happened in Dallas an impossible task. The government's first investigation was conducted by the 7-member Warren Commission. They concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone to assassinate President Kennedy. But did the Warren Commission have access to all the facts it needed? Incredibly, the answer is no. Literally thousands of documents related to the assassination were hidden or censored by agencies like the CIA and FBI. They were never shown to the Commission during its 18-month investigation.
The CIA did not share information with them. The FBI was cordial and helped to a certain extent, but they were really left largely to do it on their own, and that's a huge task for any group in that short a period of time.
In 1992, public pressure forced Congress to make one last attempt at learning the truth. The federal government responded by creating the Assassination Records Review Board.
We've come into existence at a time when we could take advantage of some of these historical forces and work with the agencies to release these records.
Their mandate? To locate and make public all records relevant to the killing of President Kennedy, including documents from the largest keeper of assassination details, the CIA. Over the years, that agency has consistently refused to cooperate with investigators. The agency covered up much of the information it had gathered.
There were lies, there were distortions, there was a cover-up, there was obstruction of justice, there were withholdings of materials from congressional committees. Many improper acts have been conducted over the last 30 years.
John Newman is a former intelligence officer, now a college professor. He spent years studying the CIA and FBI, closely examining the secret documents and files the government's review board has recently released. Files like this one, detailing highly confidential CIA methods and procedures. Records like this, outlining undercover operations in Mexico City. And these boxes, which contain Lee Harvey Oswald's secret CIA records. They are simply called File Number 201 and hold classified information about Oswald's activities in the years leading up to the assassination.
A 201 file for the CIA is an intelligence and counterintelligence file. Oswald had a 201 file. The problem was that all the things that should have been put into it were not. So, in a sense, Oswald's 201 file is more than a 201 file. It is a lens through which we can observe lots of anomalies about Oswald going on inside the CIA.
For nearly 30 years, this CIA file has been kept secret by the agency. In 1997, the Review Board forced a release of most of its contents. The Warren Commission never saw this file.
The Warren Commission didn't look at any of these CIA documents because one of the Warren commissioners was Mr. Allen Dulles, who had been head of the CIA under John Kennedy, and it was presumed that he would look into matters if they needed to be looked into. So the CIA got almost no scrutiny whatsoever from the Warren Commission.
In 1977, even when pressured by congressional investigators from the House Select Committee on Assassinations, the CIA again refused access to parts of Oswald's 201 file.
They sent a great number of administrative requests to the CIA for information about the 201 file and lists. It is now clear that in some instances the agency lied about the 201 file, about its contents, did not give the House Select Committee access to parts of the file that they knew existed and wanted to see.
The information it contains not only confirms the government's very early interest in Oswald's activities, but discloses a startling revelation. Oswald was directly involved in sensitive intelligence operations for the CIA and probably for the FBI as well.
My own guess is that a great many things that he becomes involved in with respect to the FBI and the CIA were benign. They were really legitimate intelligence operations. I'm not so certain that everything falls into that category, however, especially in Mexico City.
6 weeks before the president was murdered, Lee Harvey Oswald turned up in Mexico City. The purpose of his trip was to obtain visas from the Soviet and Cuban embassies for his return to the Soviet Union.
It was an espionage world down there. The CIA was running many sensitive operations in Mexico. Those that are most crucial to the story of Oswald would be centering on the Cuban consulate.
Exactly what Oswald did in Mexico City, where he went and who he spoke with, has been difficult to establish until now. This piece of missing evidence, written by 2 government investigators, has been kept secret for nearly 20 years. In 1997, the Review Board ordered most of the report declassified, and what it revealed was unbelievable. According to this document, the possibility exists that there may have been an Oswald impersonator, someone who looked like Oswald and may have been working for the CIA.
I was stunned myself when I saw it the first time. Even though it says it's a possibility, it's one hell of a possibility that somebody could be impersonating the man who's going to be the shooter of the president 6 weeks later.
This is a photograph of the man claiming to be Oswald. It was never seen by the Warren Commission. This series of photographs were taken by a CIA surveillance camera outside the Soviet embassy in Mexico City. Even though this man does not even resemble Oswald, the CIA knew that he entered the embassy on numerous occasions using the name Lee Harvey Oswald. But why would an Oswald imposter be in Mexico City? One intriguing possibility is that the imposter was working as part of a scheme to set up the real Oswald as the president's killer. Because the agency would have been forced to reveal its clandestine use of surveillance cameras to gather intelligence in Mexico, it chose instead to withhold this photograph, as well as additional information it knew about Oswald.
The vast majority of all the stuff we're looking at had no business being withheld for sources and methods. Ridiculous it is now to gaze upon most of these documents and ask yourself, why on earth should this piece of paper have been withheld?
But incredible as it may seem, the American public had to wait 35 years to finally gain access to these documents.
It's been devastating, because we're talking, after all, about the murder of the President of the United States. And so any obstruction of justice or investigation or any lie or deception has a much graver negative impact than the positive impact of protecting that particular asset.
CIA and FBI documents alone will not answer all of the questions surrounding the killing of President Kennedy. Some of the answers may only come from new and unexpected sources, like this long-lost film shot in Dallas on the day of the assassination and kept secret for decades. Its existence was known only to a handful of individuals. What new evidence can be found among these grainy images?
President Kennedy has been given a blood transfusion at Parkland Hospital here in Dallas in an effort to save his life.
These are the images of an American nightmare. November 22nd, 1963. President Kennedy has just been shot. Spectators are frightened and dazed. These grainy images are some of the first pictures taken at the scene. The footage was shot by local Dallas news cameramen Roy Cooper Jr. and Don Cook. And for decades, the American people did not even know this film existed. In order to avoid publicity, the cameramen kept this footage a secret until 1996, when it was released to the public by the Assassination Review Board.
I went to Dallas under the premise that I had seen pictures from Dealey Plaza, and there were literally thousands of people there who had cameras in their hand that day, thinking, where are all these pictures that were taken? Someone's got to have something in a shoebox, in a closet, that would be interesting and relevant.
What the board uncovered was this film that Roy Cooper had kept hidden for more than 30 years. Cooper was covering the president's trip to Dallas. The film was intended for use by a local television station, but the images never made it on the air. Amazingly, they were discarded by the station. Cooper secretly rescued the film from the trash and spliced the pictures together. It was never shown to government investigators, and much of it has never been seen before. Although there are no pictures of the actual assassination itself here, the film does include some very startling images.
So much of this stuff that really almost looks like filler is just so important to the historic record because we don't have anything similar to it, in other forms elsewhere. So it's just a remarkable film in that it shows from so many different viewpoints things that were happening that fills in gaps concerning the story of the assassination weekend.
Investigator Richard Trask has spent the past 10 years studying the films and photographs of the Kennedy assassination. He describes the film, which was recorded without sound by cameraman Don Cook.
As a good reporter, photographer, what he did was he started running to where the scene of action apparently was. And what you do see is very brief clips of the scene behind the grassy knoll in the area to the side of the school book depository, which was a parking area and railroad area. And what you see is Cook taking pictures probably within 2 or 3 minutes after the assassination of people getting into that area, kind of looking to see what's happening.
The sequence is short, but the pictures are extremely valuable in supporting conspiracy claims that gunshots were fired from more than one location. While some searched the area behind the grassy knoll, others distinctly heard shots coming from the school book depository.
You can see police activity starting to center in and around the Texas School Book Depository building, where reports had been given that shots had been fired from. A call went out on all police radios for all vehicles to report Code 3 Emergency 2, Elm and Houston Street, and you can see various of the cruises arriving. Again, this is not in chronological order, but it's all within now about 10 or 15 minutes.
Caught on film during the confusion was a bystander named Larry Flora. He had been looking for a telephone in the building next to the depository and was mistakenly thought to be a suspect.
Apparently somebody there thought he was suspicious looking, and as he was leaving the building, somebody tapped on a window and motioned to one of the cops down below to stop that man. And you can see in the film clip, two cops have stopped Flora. And although there's nothing that tells me this, he looks like he's intoxicated. He acts that way. And they asked him what he was doing there. They began questioning him, decided they should bring him over to the sheriff's office, which was a short ways away. And as they were escorting him, a couple people were heard to holler, "Why don't you kill the son of a bitch," and things like that.
Trask estimates that hundreds, perhaps thousands of people photographed the events on that November 22nd day. But there is one image that escaped nearly everyone. Not until review board researchers carefully screened the Cooper film had anyone ever seen a moving picture of Lyndon Johnson as he left the hospital after learning President Kennedy was dead. At this point in time, only a handful of people knew that the president had succumbed to his traumatic injuries.
Again, scenes from Parkland Hospital right after the assassination. And here we have Johnson being led by his Secret Service agent, Rufus Youngblood, and some of the congressional delegation going to an unmarked police car driven by Chief Curry and being brought as quickly as possible back to the airport before the public is told that the president is dead.
As Vice President Johnson prepares to leave for Washington, the search for the president's killer intensifies, and pictures of grief and mourning are replaced by anger and fear. Who killed the president, and was more than one person involved? According to Trask, the Cooper film helps debunk at least one conspiracy theory, that involving Jack Ruby working with Lee Harvey Oswald. What fueled the conspiracy theory is this picture, taken outside the depository just minutes after the assassination by amateur photographer Phil Willis.
There's a man who looks very much like Jack Ruby, balding, pudgy face, dark glasses, suit coat on. And many conspirator believers thought, well, if Ruby's in Dealey Plaza at the time of the assassination, there must be some linkage between Ruby and Oswald, or what's he doing there?
From a different angle, that same man appears in the Cooper film.
It's very hard to locate him. You can just, for a moment, slightly see this man in the corner here, what looks to be a Jack Ruby look-alike.
By comparing times and locations with the Willis photo, Trask was able to determine that they were indeed pictures of the same man, but not of Jack Ruby.
The picture tells the truth, but it doesn't always tell the full truth, so you have to be able to compare and contrast one picture to another. So this picture led me to believe that the Willis picture, in fact, was not of Jack Ruby. So I think that controversy can finally be put to rest.
But Jack Ruby would make himself known to the world soon enough. Hours after the president's assassination, a disturbing moment was captured on the Cooper film. The image of Jack Ruby, clearly present at the police news conference with Lee Harvey Oswald.
This is just before Oswald is brought into what's called the show-up room, where the press conference, or actually the viewing of Oswald, was made around midnight, the 22nd into the 23rd. This man right here, who's leaning over in front of the various other press photographers, is Jack Ruby. He has no business being where he is.
It remains a total mystery how Ruby gained access to the press briefing at police headquarters and why he was there. He later bragged to reporters that he was carrying a gun. Whether he intended to shoot Oswald that night or was planning Oswald's assassination, no one knows for sure. But as Ruby watched, Oswald proclaimed his innocence. What explanations had Oswald given to the FBI earlier that afternoon, and why was his interrogation stopped after only 1 hour of questioning? A revealing document, thought to have been lost for more than 30 years, may hold the answers to both those questions. Today, at the 6th Floor Museum in Dallas, Texas, fascinated tourists view Lee Harvey Oswald's sniper's nest from behind a plexiglass barrier, a silent monument to a national tragedy. But on November 22, 1963, in this building once called the Texas School Book Depository, those boxes and that window were a scene that triggered a moment which horrified the entire nation. This film of the book depository's 6th floor was shot in the first frantic minutes after the assassination by television news cameraman Tom Allier. Obtained by the Review Board in 1996, Allier's film contains the only moving pictures of the police investigation of the 6th floor.
He took a 16mm camera, 3 extra reels of film, got out of the car and ran towards the book depository. Took some general views of what was happening, and then was the only cameraman or even photographer who actually got into the book depository at a time before the police were doing a full-scale search. He was there for the next several hours because they sealed the building.
As the search for Kennedy's assassin began, police and Secret Service agents insisted that everyone leave the building, but they were too busy to enforce their orders. Tom Allier remained inside and kept taking pictures.
He also took film of evidence as it was being found on the 6th floor, including the finding of the Mannlicher Carcano rifle that was Oswald's. And all the time he was trying to skirt around so that he wouldn't be thrown out, trying to get available light with his camera so he'd be able to have something. And he just took a wonderful series of film.
To get his film out of the building, Allier threw it to his partner waiting below an open window. Some of the film was eventually broadcast on WFAA News. Some of it was thrown away. Allier gathered up the remaining pieces of footage and spliced them together, then inexplicably hid the film for 22 years.
Allier saw that at WFAA they were generating so much film that the people who were in the control area were saying, as soon as it's shown, next day, let's get rid of this because it's just accumulating. And he understood that this is raw history.
Throughout the afternoon of November 22nd, as portions of Allier's films were being broadcast, the scene here at police headquarters was total confusion. Reporters and photographers roamed the halls looking for information. An inner office of the Homicide Division was used as an interrogation room. It was there that the police and FBI had a chance to question their primary suspect, Lee Harvey Oswald. As they began their interrogation, no stenographer or recording device was available. The only record of Oswald's interrogation were the handwritten notes taken by the FBI. These notes were thought to have been destroyed more than 30 years ago. But that was not what happened. In 1997, a book about the assassination was published that drew the Review Board's attention to its author, James Hosty. He was the first FBI agent to interrogate Oswald on the night of the assassination.
My first impression of Lee Oswald was that he was very self-assured, very cocky. He had a demeanor that he knew something that he wasn't going to tell it, you know, and he was just going to play games with us.
In 1963, Hosty worked as a special agent in counterintelligence for the FBI in Dallas. He was familiar with Lee Harvey Oswald and his pro-Soviet activities. 3 hours after the president was shot, Hosty was summoned to police headquarters to help question Oswald.
When I got to the police department, it was overrun by press. There were hundreds of people there. I recognized some of them, and I know they weren't in the news media, and they had no business being there. They were just onlookers and were just gawkers, and it was total chaos.
Unknown to the Dallas police, Hosty had been informed of a trip Oswald had just made to Mexico.
We had received a communication, top secret communication from the CIA about a month before, that Lee Oswald had been in contact with the Soviets in Mexico City. Now, I might add, this is important, that FBI headquarters neglected to tell me, they knew, but they neglected to tell me that the man that Oswald was in contact with was the chief assassin for the KGB for the Western Hemisphere.
Why was Oswald in touch with a KGB agent named Valery Vladimirovich? Hosty knew he was onto something important. He was anxious to question Oswald further, but that was not to happen.
The one time that he lost his cool at all was when I asked him about Mexico City. He immediately got startled and said, "How did you know about that?" And no, I know. And then he started to deny it. Now, I think that was the one point. If we had been allowed to talk to Oswald alone, I think we might have gotten to him at that point.
Hosty's interrogation was cut short. Oswald's denial about traveling to Mexico City was therefore never followed up. FBI superiors never allowed Hosty to complete his questioning.
I was ordered out of the interrogation of Oswald and told not to tell the police department anything. That was, in my opinion, was the first move of what I call a benign cover-up.
Some speculate the FBI considered the Mexico City information too sensitive to be revealed to the public. They were concerned that Hosty's questions might compromise CIA operations. When asked by the Warren Commission to produce his notes, Hosty told investigators he followed standard FBI procedure and destroyed them.
Somebody from the Warren Commission asked me, "Where are those notes?" And I was kind of startled. I'm supposed to destroy them, and I said, I believe I destroyed them, which I think at that time I did believe I had destroyed them.
Later, Hosty rediscovered his notes in a desk drawer. Unsure of their value, he held on to them for 32 years until the review board tracked him down. Less than 48 hours after Hosty's interrogation, Lee Harvey Oswald was dead. The mysteries of his life were further complicated by theories of conspiracy. Some say Oswald could not have acted alone. That was the thinking of New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison, who prosecuted a man named Clay Shaw, the only person ever tried for President Kennedy's murder. The files from that trial were ordered destroyed. More than 20 years later, the review board found the one man who stopped their destruction. Almost immediately after the Warren Commission named Lee Harvey Oswald as the lone gunman in the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, conspiracy theories began to circulate. One of the most tangled explanations for the assassination has its roots here in New Orleans. In 1967, New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison began his own investigation into Kennedy's death. It ended with the trial of the only man ever prosecuted for the president's murder. Garrison was certain the assassination resulted from a conspiracy involving the government and organized crime.
Well, New Orleans in many respects is a sideshow to the assassination. It includes the only prosecution of anyone ever for the murder of President Kennedy, which was a New Orleans businessman named Clay Shaw, who was tried over 25 or so days and promptly acquitted by the jury.
Garrison accused Shaw of conspiring with Oswald to murder the president. The accusations made headlines, but some called him a publicity seeker, believing that Garrison was simply feeding on the popular sentiment that Oswald could not have acted alone. For 4 years, the Assassination Review Board battled to release classified evidence that could possibly reveal new information about the assassination. What they uncovered was a rare and remarkable assortment of previously unseen documents. These are the transcripts of the grand jury proceedings in the Shaw case. Transcripts like these are always kept secret. They were locked inside the district attorney's office until they were uncovered by this man, Gary Raymond. For 7 years, beginning in 1974, Raymond was a special investigator for the city's district attorney, Harry Connick. Shortly after Connick took office, he ordered that hundreds of old files be destroyed. After prying open the lock on a dusty cabinet, Raymond came across the Shaw grand jury transcripts.
Once we jacked open that last file cabinet, I started thumbing through the contents, and there were some names that didn't mean anything to me, but I came across the testimony of Marina Oswald, and I instantly knew that this was relevant to Garrison's investigation of Clay Shaw. It was like, wow, history. You know, history just hit me in the face.
But District Attorney Connick was not happy with Raymond's discovery. He and Garrison were bitter political enemies. According to Raymond, Connick wanted none of Garrison's files left around the office, including the secret grand jury transcripts.
He said, this is trash. This is junk. This whole investigation was nothing but the overactive imagination of Jim Garrison. He says, I want that crap out of this building, and I want it out of this building today. And with that, he walked out the grand jury door and slammed it.
But instead of burning the files as he was ordered to do, Raymond packed them up in the trunk of his car and hid them for more than 20 years.
My intention was to get the papers, get the documents to somebody who would take care of them and preserve them.
31 years later, the transcripts went to Washington, where they were turned over to the review board and made public. Raymond was prosecuted and was found guilty of violating state secrecy laws. He is hoping to avoid jail time.
If they want to put me in jail for doing what I thought was the moral, proper thing to do in light of the historical significance of these documents, then they can put me in jail.
In 1996, another valuable document was discovered by the review board. Hidden among the 6,000 papers related to the prosecution of Clay Shaw was a 30-year-old diary. It contains the recollections of Tom Bethel, who worked as a researcher for Jim Garrison on the Shaw case. For 18 months, Bethel recorded confidential details about the trial, but later lost track of his diary.
I haven't seen this document, which is a Xerox copy of the typescript of my diary. I have not seen it for nearly 30 years.
But for Tom Bethel, even time has not diminished the memories of Jim Garrison, a district attorney who he says was out of control.
I think that he was, in some respects, crazy. I mean, I think that he probably believed what he was saying about there being a conspiracy. And I think he believed that Clay Shaw would ultimately never be brought to trial because the government was going to have to come in and kill him before he ever actually gets brought to trial.
On September 14th, 1967, Bethel wrote about Garrison in his diary.
I remember one Sunday when we were holding staff meetings in the middle of the day, he started to talk to the assembled lawyers about the paramilitary operation in Dealey Plaza. He got carried away and was talking about platoons of National Guardsmen hiding in churches, infantry movements, armored convoys moving through Dallas, underground canteen facilities in a huge dugout under Dealey Plaza, and so on. It was entertaining, it was amusing, but you know, you have to realize also that real people were being charged and, in the case of Clay Shaw, brought to trial and accused of committing the crime of the century.
Shaw was arrested by the New Orleans police on March 1st, 1967. It would take more than 30 years for crucial missing evidence related to his trial to mysteriously reappear. Soon after Shaw's death, in 1994, a person wishing to remain anonymous offered his personal papers to the review board. 23 boxes containing photographs, business records, passports, and most revealing of all, Clay Shaw's typed diary.
And so it begins. This journal, which is to be a record of the most horrifying, unbelievable, nightmarish experience through which I have ever lived. March the 1st will be certainly the great day in my life. for it was on March 1st that I was arrested for conspiring with others to murder the President, John F. Kennedy.
For Clay Shaw, the nightmare of prosecution was only just the beginning of his tormented story.
It is important that I try to set down for myself and possibly others the Kafkaesque horror which began on this date.
Bethel and others believed Garrison's case against Shaw was flawed from the beginning.
They were able to get witnesses because they had potential drug charges against them. So rather than be prosecuted and thrown into the awful New Orleans prison, some of these people were prepared to come up with statements to help Garrison's investigation. And that's basically what was going on.
On March 15th, 1968, Bethel wrote in his own diary,
"It now looks as though there is no alternative to the clear-cut conclusion that Clay Shaw is completely innocent." Now, I could see that, and I think, frankly, just about everybody in the office could see it. But Jim Garrison, I really think, could not see it, because his mind was so befuddled by his belief in his own mad theories.
After 34 days of testimony, it took the jury less than 1 hour to acquit Clay Shaw of conspiracy to kill the president. Jim Garrison considered the verdict an oversight. His successor, District Attorney Harry Connick, believed Garrison's theories groundless. For many years, he ignored subpoenas and refused to release the files related to the Shaw case. Finally, a Supreme Court decision forced Connick to turn over all the documents. In the spring of 1998, the Review Board flew to New Orleans to recover the files related to the Garrison investigation.
Well, I think it was the correct decision. I think the board does have the authority to obtain this type of information. It's directly related to the assassination. No one disputes that. So I think it was the correct decision, and everyone has recognized it now, and the information's being released.
But what about other material that the Review Board has not been able to declassify or release? In the aftermath of President John F. Kennedy's assassination, Americans found themselves with few answers. His death could not have happened under more mysterious and puzzling circumstances. And with so much misinformation, deception, and missing evidence, will we ever find the truth? One of the key pieces of information relating to Kennedy's death is a film that very few people even know exists. What we do know is that a home movie was filmed from the car immediately behind the president's limousine. It is a short film shot by Kennedy's close friend and political advisor, Dave Powers. Minutes before the assassination, Powers was taking home movies from a car behind the president's limousine. Although asked by the Review Board to make his film available to the public, Powers stubbornly declined.
He believed that his film was his own personal property that he had taken. And I think, being a personal friend of the president's, he didn't want to give up something that was so valuable to himself.
Although Powers died in 1998, he left instructions that the film not be released to the public.
The American public deserve to know the information that's hidden in the shoeboxes, hidden in dusty old files. It's time to share that information with the public.
Uncovering all the government's classified information was the mandate of the Assassination Records Review Board. However, the board's term expired in September 1998, and with its offices now closed, we may never see this film, and the information it could reveal may never be known.
Well, I think history will look at the Review Board as a group that had a limited purpose and a focus and came in and worked very hard and got that done. Certainly, whether the review board's information that's shared with the American public changes the way anyone looks at the assassination is an open question, and I wouldn't pretend to try to answer that.
With this new access to these documents, researchers are now beginning to find answers to questions that have confounded the public for decades, including the questions most often asked. Who killed President Kennedy, and did the assassination involve a CIA-backed conspiracy?
I think the idea of a high-level institutional plot within the CIA to kill John Kennedy is crazy. On the other hand, somebody lower down in the organization who knew what a sensitive file we were talking about here with Oswald could have looked at him as a perfect patsy. So we are nowhere near out of the woods where we could theorize that some low-level agency people might have been involved.
The Kennedy assassination is like a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle for which we have 100,000 pieces. And the problem is to find out, to winnow away the irrelevant pieces that don't really belong there.
But still the question remains, what is the American public to conclude about Kennedy's assassination?
The public has always wanted to believe that it's got to be a big conspiracy that puts down our president. It can't be a little nobody who did that. Because if a little nobody can change the course of American history, what does that mean about us and our place in the world? It means that the world is really a more scary place than most of us want to believe.
In my opinion, we will know who killed John Kennedy, but it's not going to be for a while. The answers will be in the archives, 90%, but there's going to be a certain set of questions and answers that are going to turn up in the shoebox or underneath the house or in the attic. It's not going to just be in government files.
Will we ever get all the answers to the Kennedy assassination? Absolutely not. Good information, lousy information, truths, half-truths, lies, innuendos. It's very hard to really go through that entire logjam of material to come up with anything that really approaches the truth to all of the questions.
Finding answers may not be easy, but the simple democratic principles of openness and accountability demand that we try.
I think hopefully we have taught government and perhaps American people too that information can be shared, that the Republic will survive and may even be strengthened through sharing information about actions of government officials.
This is a sad time for all people.
After more than 3 frustrating decades of unanswered questions, the search for clues to one of the most perplexing mysteries of the modern age may only have just begun.